All right, let's turn now. It's about 9 or 10 minutes into the study. Let's turn now to Romans 14, Unplugged, Feasts and Fasts and Food, oh my. This is a study that's ongoing, and by ongoing, I also mean that it's updated as needed. So if you scroll down into the study, you'll notice by the date right here that I updated this just less than a week ago, as I'm finding new information that I think is relevant to understand. What we're working our way through now is something that should have been put together. If I were a better writer, if I were someone who's just a little bit more skilled at what I do, then I probably would have had all this put together at the beginning. But you'll have to pardon my limitations. I'm doing the best I can. But in my interest to get the information out to you, I decided to go back and add more information in the introduction, background, and historical audience. So what we're doing is we're working our way through this section in my study, the background and historical information, and we've worked our way down through all of these lengthy quotes, and we're finally parked at one final quote from Dr. Mark Nanos, one of my favorite historians, Jewish historian, and this is going to show up in my conclusions. So let me just scroll all the way down to the conclusion section. So for tonight, let's finish reading this. I don't think we'll finish this, but we'll start here reading down through some of the conclusions of the historical background and appreciating Paul's audience. And I think it's self-explanatory, so I'll just jump in and start reading. These are my own words. In the end, the exact amount of Jewish and Christian social, religious, and communal involvement in ancient Rome may remain a mystery until we are able to, as I like to think, one day have a long-awaited conversation with Priscilla and Aquila, right? As I put the word smile in my commentary. Wouldn't that be nice someday, as we'll be able to chat with them? Why did I choose them? Because they were present in the Roman communities, in the Roman church, if you want to call it that, the Roman synagogue, I like to call it. And Paul wasn't even there. He's writing to a group of people, and he's not there at the moment. But he's probably writing from Corinth, if I'm correct. And so he's writing there to this group of people, so he maybe not have a first-hand knowledge of what they were going through. But Priscilla and Aquila did, so it would be nice to be able to chat with them someday. So I go on to say, but until that time, as Bible students and as historians, we can in fact gain a more well-rounded approximation of the situation by doing our due diligence when it comes to historical research, both Christian as well as secular. And this goes really without saying, but I have to mention it anyway. When you're doing your research, it's my understanding that it's better to include Christian resources first, but then as it pertains to any particular field of study, such as history or geography or language or medicine or whatever field that is related to the biblical topic that you're looking at, I think it's helpful to broaden your research to include people within those fields of study, people who are experts in that particular area. So if you're studying history, feel free to broaden your research to include non-Christian but yet ancient historians, like I'm doing with this with Dr. Mark Nanos, who is himself a Jewish historian. He's not a Christian historian, but I don't think that should be detrimental when it comes to research, when it comes to trying to figure out what was the world like in Paul's day. So again, I would do the same thing when it came to language. If I was trying to better understand the language options in Paul's day, the ancient Greek, the ancient Hebrew, the ancient Aramaic, the ancient Latin, and things like that, then shouldn't it make sense that I should turn to language specialists in their field, regardless of whether or not they're Christian or whatever religious background they come from? I shouldn't really discriminate against people based on a religion, is the point I'm trying to make. I get a little bit, not a lot, but a little bit of pushback on this because I've been using Dr. Nanos, who's a Jewish historian, but he's not Christian. And some people write into me and say, why would you want to get the perspective of a non-Christian theologian? Well, we do the same thing with Josephus, right? Was Josephus Christian? Not, as far as I can tell, he wasn't. We listen to Pliny the Younger and things like that. We allow Tacitus to speak to us. All of our history shouldn't come from Christians, is the point I'm trying to say. Some historians have a lot of information that they can share with us, regardless of their Christian perspective or not. So that's all I'm trying to say. If you don't agree with me, that's fine. Just know that this is the perspective I'm taking. I go on to say, indeed, as a conclusion to this section on background and historical audience, Nanos poses this timely and important question with regards to properly appreciating the historical issues as they apply to Romans. Listen to this question. This is just one question out of many that he likes to pose. As a Jewish historian, he asks this question: Would the Christian Gentiles of Rome have sought association with the synagogue as the righteous Gentiles? This phrase, righteous Gentiles, is a term that you do find in rabbinic writings, and it refers to Gentiles who are seeking to associate with Israel's God, seeking to associate with Israel's people and the scriptures and promises of Israel, so much so that many of these Gentiles eventually go on to become proselytes to Judaism. But one need not even go that far to be able to see these types of Gentiles in the Bible. For instance, the first one that pops in my head is Cornelius in Acts chapter 10. And if you recall from the story, Cornelius was not a Jew, but he is someone that's spoken of highly by the Jewish communities. He prays to the one God of Israel, and as far as I can tell, at the time that that Luke records the details, he's not even a believer in Messiah Yeshua yet. And though God hears his prayers, he's well spoken of by the Jewish community, as I mentioned. Peter meets with him, and eventually he makes a profession of faith and gets baptized and joins the community of faith. So the point is, from a Jewish perspective, because he's not converted to Judaism, he's not a convert, he's not a proselyte, he would be considered a God-fearer. That's a technical term, but he falls under the category of a righteous Gentile. A Gentile who is seeking the righteousness that's offered exclusively through a belief in God, a monotheistic affirmation of God as the one true God of Israel and of the nations eventually, and particularly goes on to even pursue certain amounts of Torah obedience, although there were some there were still some restrictions going on in the earlier first century and things like that. But isn't that an interesting question? Would these Gentiles of Rome have sought association with the synagogue as the righteous Gentiles? Or would they have turned away? And if so, why? Why would they have wanted to be included in Jewish communal social settings? I go on to say that I imagine his answer might surprise some, and in his book, The Mystery of Romans, he makes this particular statement. So let's read some quote. And this is a book. Let me go ahead and flash a picture of the book right now, real quick on the screen. For those of you who are watching this video on YouTube, you can see this picture. Those of you who are in my live study class right now, you can't see anything. The Mystery of Romans, Fortress Press, I believe. It's over 20 years old. It's one of Nanos' first books, among many that he would go on to write, as he's trying to gain a better appreciation and understanding of Jewish and Gentile relations in the first century, as it pertains to someone of Jewish background and why that would be important to someone as a Jew, such as himself. So here's what he has to say. This is Mark Nanos. Quote, Josephus indicated that Julius Caesar's decree forbid the assembly of foreign religious societies other than Jewish ones in the city of Rome, and according to Suetonius, Caesar had dissolved all guilds except those of ancient foundation. The first sentence is something that's pretty much agreed upon in most Christian circles, that Caesar's degree of limiting what type of religious societies and organizations could practice freely in ancient Rome without certain restrictions. Most Christian authors agree with that particular assessment, and I think that's important to set the tone for understanding when we're trying to put our mind back into, could the Christianities of Paul's day could they have legitimately expressed their religion so openly in ancient Roman society? Yes, Rome allowed for religions basically, as far as I can ascertain, they did allow for just about any religious group to have an expression of their religion. so long as that religious group, and here's the important part, continued to pay the as Roman citizens and slaves and things like that, continued to pay the expected devotion to the imperial cult. So there was an expected, mandated service to imperial matters as relates to recognizing the emperor as a god, paying certain taxes to the emperor, giving attention to certain cultic activities, the Saturnalia and the religious activities, certain religious festivals that Rome mandated, the temple services, the prostitution of girls. All of that was kind of tied up into this expectation for Roman citizens and people who lived in Rome, regardless of if you had citizenship or not. There was this kind of it was mandated in many cases, but you could get some exemptions according to certain recognition of people groups, and so that's kind of what we're talking about. And most Christians agree with that particular background perspective. Let's continue. Nano states, how would Christians outside associating with the synagogues obtain the right to congregate for fellowship and worship even in their own homes or tenement rooms unless they petition for designation as a private club? So if the Christianities, for example, the Gentile Christians wanted to separate themselves completely from Judaism and yet still have the right to worship and to be exempt to some degree from the imperial cult mandated emperor worship and the complete with, again, all of its pagan involvement at the temple level, the pagan temples, the mandated prostitution, and things like that. We already know that theologically speaking, this would have been problematic for Christians, especially as we understand Paul's explaining to the Gentiles that their allegiance now is to one God and to one Messiah, and their fellowship is not with pagan temples and idolatry anymore, but they are to make a break from all of that. And therefore, at the same time, Paul definitely doesn't want the Gentile Christians to simply wholesale convert to Judaism and take that ethnic status or take that legal status so that they could fall underneath those exemptions that were already being afforded to the Judaisms. So what that does is it puts the Gentile Christians between a rock and a hard place. Paul says, on the one hand, don't convert. I mean, how convenient would it be if you did? Because if you did, then all that you believe in religiously, one God, one Messiah, relevancy of scriptures and a new calendar and things like that, all of this would be easy for you to express in your religious life, because Judaism has already been given those particular freedoms and exemptions. They're already designated as a private club or whatever, an ancient foundation. But Paul says, I don't want you to do that. I don't want you to convert to Judaism, to becoming legally recognized Jews. On the other hand, you need to make a decisive break from your pagan lifestyles. You need to make a break from the imperial cult. The emperor is not a god, and you should not worship him as a god. He is not your Messiah, and therefore you need to stop attending the pagan ceremonies and the all of that pageantry and all the Saturnalia and all of the worship of the stars and the what do we call it, the stoicheia and all that stuff, right? Give that all up as well, because you are now citizens of the one true God of heaven and followers of the one true Messiah. So they are in a rock and a hard place. So that's why we have to have these types of discussions, so that we can appreciate that Rome didn't really just allow any old religion to express themselves and do whatever they wanted to do, however they wanted to do it. Not like today. Not like today, people. Get that out of your head. That's anachronistic to think, oh, yeah, these were Christians, right? They weren't Jews. They weren't practicing Judaism. They were practicing Christianity. They could do whatever they wanted as Christians. I don't think so. All right. Every really good every historian who's worth his title as an historian recognizes some of the things that I'm talking about. Maybe not in all the details, because I'm not a historian. I'm standing on the shoulders of other historians. But let me continue. This is Nanos. He says, quote, not only do we not have any evidence of such an effort, right, the Christians applying for private club status so that they can practice their Christian religion away from Judaism, but away from the imperial code. Not only do we not have any evidence of such an effort, But we also have good reason to believe that they did not pursue such a course, as they found the authority of the synagogue sufficient, and they probably did not even consider the question. Is that kind of beginning to make sense as well? Why would they even think that they needed to make a break from Judaism? The history tells us that the first century Christians considered themselves as an offshoot of Judaism. The book of Acts and some of the apostolic writings go on to describe the Christianity of the first century as a sect known as the Way, meaning they were an offshoot of a Jewish religion. They were practicing a subset of Judaism, a form of Judaism. The religion that was that we know as first century Christianity overlapped so much so with first century Judaism that one of the primary differences between them was simply the ethnicity of the people groups. But other than that, the religion itself was cross-cultural Judaism. I say cross-cultural, meaning there were certain things that Gentiles were allowed to do as righteous Gentiles without going the full step of becoming converting to Judaism. Now, let me see. Somewhere along the lines, there's a quote. Let me click on this footnote. Let me see if that's the one. Yeah, this is the footnote I want to read. I apologize for having to get so lengthy, but okay, so let me read that last sentence again so they can read the footnote and help you understand why it makes sense. So Nanos proposes, not only do we not have any evidence of such an effort, right? Gentiles seeking to make a break from their Jewish cradle. We don't have them doing it. It did happen eventually. Don't get me wrong. Christianity became the state religion. Christianity broke from Judaism. It became the official religion of Rome. This is, of course, after Nero's persecution and all that stuff, his martyring of the Christians. But eventually, Constantine, fast forward a couple hundred years, and Constantine's going to declare Christianity as the state religion. And so Christianity is really, the break between the church and synagogue is concrete. It's set in stone at some point in time. But very earlier on, we're still talking even before the destruction of the temple, there's no such break, nor does there seem to be an effort from the Christianities or Paul to make such a break. So we don't have any evidence of this effort, but we have good reason to believe that they did not pursue such a course, as they found the authority of the synagogue sufficient, and they probably didn't even consider the idea or the question of, hey, should we make a break? Now, let me pull in a quote, a footnote. Normally I don't read the footnotes, but this time this one's significant. This is a footnote from Mark Nanos' book himself, the one that we're reading, the Mystery to Romans. Let me read this footnote. It's a bit lengthy, but it's relevant. Regarding the legal status, see the discussions of Lampe, right? This is another author, and he's got a book that he put together. I'm not even going to try to pretend to pronounce the German there, the title. But here's a quote from that particular work. So this is one historian quoting another historian trying to gain a better understanding of what's going on in Paul's day. The fractionation of Roman Christianity concerning the private rather than public nature of the property and possessions during the first and second centuries, hence the lack of evidence for legal status suggested, for lack of evidence, that the Christian groups had organized themselves as collegia tenurium or collegia funeratitia, trying to get my Latin correct there. This other author goes on to say, the hypothesis has long been abandoned. So what Nanos is trying to alert us to the fact is that in Christian research, it has been previously assumed that the Christian groups did try to seek some form of legitimacy outside and beyond Jewish synagogue authority and kind of set up their own private club, as it were. And there were some designations that were possibly available to them: the Collegia Tenurium, Tenuiorum, I think or Collegia Funeratitia. These are two of the designations that they could have applied for, but that hypothesis is kind of outdated now. Historians have now come to realize, Christian ones included, that there's no evidence that supports that they did such a thing. So we've abandoned that particular perspective because it's weak and it lacks evidence. Indeed, that the groups of Christians were not legalized as corpora or collegia, right? is one of the more certain statements which we can make. That statement alone should kind of surprise many of you. So we know that they weren't separate, is the point that's the whole point of this little quote here. But this other author continues. N.T. Wright, and here's a quote from Dr. Wright himself, says that there's no evidence that they appealed to private club status in their defense. So again, one historian quoting more historians, although N.T. Wright happens to be a Christian historian that Nanos is quoting. Dr. James D. Junn, who just recently passed away last year, he is a Christian historian. He writes in his commentary to Romans, quote, "The Christians were not yet clearly distinguished from the wider Jewish community. Insofar as they had any legal status, they would meet presumably as a collegium or under the auspices of a synagogue." So understanding what we're talking about here, we have historians on both sides of the camp now, both Christian and non-Christian, who are coming to the accepted fact that the Christians in the first century were not operating separately from a legal status perspective. In Rome's eyes, they were not operating legally separate from the Jewish synagogues, meaning all this is saying is that it disagrees with what we read about in the Bible already. And Paul confesses this, that the Christianities of the first century were a sect of Judaism, plain and simple. And that's something that, unfortunately, many Christian pastors are uncomfortable with admitting, at least along this point in time. They want to somehow give the Gentile Christianity some legal status outside of their Jewish foundation that gives them the support of claiming that they don't have to follow after Torah or follow Judaism the way Jews do, or something to that effect. But unfortunately, the research it demonstrates quite the opposite. And I've given you at least 3 or 4 resources now, besides Nanos and Dunn and Wright and the Lempier, or whatever the gentleman's name that I mentioned earlier. So this footnote goes on to conclude, here the fact that Paul never speaks of the Christians in Rome as a church, right, the ecclesia, the church of Rome, right, he doesn't even use that phrase in his letter, may well be significant, especially since it is so out of keeping with Paul's usual practice like he does in the rest of his letters. And we've got some references to some of the other letters where Paul normally addresses the communities as the church of right, in Corinth, Philippians, Thessalonica, Galatians, things like that, the church at or the church in. But in Romans, he doesn't even use the word church of or ecclesia, something like that. At least he doesn't call them the church of Rome. I think he does use the word ecclesia maybe once or twice in the letter, but I don't want to look at that right now. Okay, so that's the footnote that I wanted to point out to you. Let's keep reading down through Nanos's quote in his book. This is from The Mystery of Romans. He says, quote, "Further, even if they sought and were granted the rights of assembly of a private club," right? Let's just assume that they did for a moment. "This would not have extended to the free practice of their religion without harm or interference, i.e. they would still not have had the right to observe the Sabbath," right? And why wouldn't they have? Because as Roman citizens who are not under the exemption that was afforded to the Judaisms, right, then Romans who are not Jews, even if they practiced the religion of Judaism like the God-fearing Gentiles did or the righteous Gentiles did, the proselytes would be different because they were fully legally Jewish. But without that legal Jewish status, then the seventh-day Sabbath, that is Saturday on our calendar, would have been another work day for your average Gentile Roman citizen, particularly even so much so for the slaves, right? Slaves didn't just have the opportunity to say, you know what? We're Christians and we're a sect of Judaism, so we're going to keep a seventh-day Sabbath. We're going to take a break from that day. We don't want to work. How would those Roman masters have allowed, or even how would they have received their slaves who suddenly became Christians who wanted to take a good work day off? That's not going to work. So go back and look at your history again, and you'll find that what I'm saying is actually true. Particularly when it came to slaves, but even also when it came to freedmen. Remember, ancient Rome practiced a caste system. Right? They had a class system. We don't have that in America, so we're a little bit removed from that. But there are some countries in the world who still practice class and caste systems, like India. I'm trying to think of off the top of my head. Ancient Korea did in the past. They don't anymore, but they used to have a class system, caste system. Well, ancient Rome had a class slash caste system. And so we had, you had freedmen, you had the slaves, we had the plebes, we had the barbarians, we had all these different caste groups that fell into different slots, socially speaking, and you only had certain rights depending on who you were. And being able to have Sabbath freedom wouldn't have been something that was just automatically granted to you unless you were a legally recognized Jew, which, remember, Paul said, don't do it, don't convert. All right, so Nanos continues. These Christians, these Gentile Christians, also would not have been free from serving in civic cults, like I talked about earlier, allegiance to the imperial worship, nor to the right to refrain from the mandatory practice of declaring Caesar as their god. Jews were exempt from this practice only by the institution of a special substitutionary sacrifice. So notice this, please, people, listen up, because this is actually very important. The Jews in the first century, at least in Rome, had an exemption from the Roman authorities of declaring Caesar as their god based on the fact that Jews were using their own temple to actually sacrifice a substitutionary sacrifice on behalf of Caesar, not the same as declaring Caesar as God, but they were saying, okay, we're going to have this little sacrifice on the side. How much of that was the detail known to the people, is we don't know. We don't have all the details, but part of it shows up in ancient Jewish writings as well. So it's corroborated from the other side as well. But the Jewish people were required to do this little substitutionary sacrifice on behalf of Caesar, not declaring him as a god, but kind of this little kind of we'll recognize his authority with our little sacrifice, but we're still sacrificing to God. In our minds and our hearts, we know we're sacrificing to God. This is his temple. We're not going to, if we were to sacrifice to Caesar as a god in our own temple, I mean, that's blasphemy. That's treason. That's mutiny against God himself. We're not going to do that as Jews. So the Jews were given an exemption from declaring and worshiping the civil cults and mandatory temple worship and things like that at the pagan cults based on this little substitutionary sacrifice. But how did the Christians fit in? Please answer that question for me. The Christians were still required to have that mandatory declaration of Caesar as their God. Oh, but wait a minute. Paul doesn't want them to do that. There's only one God. His name is Hashem, right? He is your Lord, and Yeshua is your Messiah. So don't do that. Oh, but don't convert to Judaism either. You see how this is beginning to make a little bit more sense if we begin to allow history to speak to this situation. These Christian Gentiles would also not have had the exclusion of military service and other public responsibilities with their concomitant idolatry. So all of this leads to painting a picture of it was very difficult for the Christianities in Paul's day to have any sort of legitimacy, legally speaking, separate from their Jewish association. It was a good thing to be associated with the synagogue because as Gentiles who were worshiping the God of Israel, the Messiah of Israel, the Holy Spirit of Israel, and rooted in the scriptures of Israel and the promises given to Israel and the patriarchs, right? Notice all of the Israel focus there that I keep bringing up. It was a good thing, not a bad thing. It was a good thing for the first century Gentile Christianity to be rooted and connected to the Judaisms of that day, because there was a lot of freedom to worship theologically the way that Paul would have agreed with. Remember, and I say this over and over again, there was no other legitimate form of religious practice that Paul would have endorsed in the first century other than some form of Judaism, right? Paul would not have embraced any form of paganism or idolatry or any pantheon of gods, any Greek, Hellenized, Zeus worship, any Mars Hill theology, any form of, if there was any Buddhism in that day, I'm not aware of it. I think Buddhism as a religion was in existence, but we don't read about it in the scriptures that I'm aware of. So Paul wouldn't have embraced that. Any Confucianism, he wouldn't have embraced that. We certainly know there wasn't any Islam at the time of Paul's writing, right? Islam wasn't around yet, so he wouldn't have embraced it even if it was. There was no Catholicism yet. To what extent he would have embraced it, I don't know, but it's a moot point because there wasn't anything like that. There was no Mormonism. There was no Jehovah's Witnesses, no Seventh-day Adventists. None of that was available as a religious choice in Paul's day. What did Paul have to work with? The various forms of Judaism, and that's it. That's it. And the other. That was kind of the binary way of viewing the world from Paul's perspective. Okay, you're either a monotheistic believer in the God of Israel and the Messiah of Israel and the scriptures of Israel and the promises given to Israel, or you're outside of the scope of truth. And so that's a good place for us to stop and contemplate these concepts. Let me read this one paragraph, and then we'll close this part of our study tonight. And then next week we'll finish. I believe we will be able to finish this next week. One more lengthy quote from Nanos. But let me finish this last paragraph here, and that'll bring this part of our study to a close. There's good reason then, historically, to suggest that Paul's instructions in Romans may have been directly to Gentile Christians who were in need of being reminded, quote-unquote, boldly of their obligation to, quote-unquote, subordinate themselves to the governing authorities of the synagogues to which they were attached, including such matters as obedience to the operative halachot, that is kind of ways of walking, the halachot for defining proper behavior for righteous Gentiles, i.e. the apostolic decree, the Noahide commandments, or whatever you want to call them there. They didn't really have a name yet. And the payment of taxes and other community obligations. So in plain language, the Gentile Christianities of Paul's day were not really defined separate and against other than. There wasn't yet the othering hadn't really taken place yet in Paul's day. Paul saw the Gentile Christians as connected and practicing. Indeed, Nanos calls it a form of Judaism. I'm going to add the phrase kind of cross-cultural Judaism, because it was a form of Judaism that wasn't completely identical to their Jewish counterparts. In other words, Paul was not championing physical circumcision for the Gentiles. We know that's true. Therefore, the form of Judaism that he was wanting his Gentiles to practice didn't have every element equal with the Jewish versions on the other side of the tracks. It was a form of Judaism. It was a subset of Judaism, right? What I would say, a sect of Judaism. I mean, these are the terminologies that the Bible already uses. But it was not 100% full-blown, the same type of Judaism that, for instance, Paul as an ethnic Jew practiced. A little bit different. That's the point I'm trying to make. And Nanos concludes, and we'll finish our study with this statement tonight. Nanos states, that is, Paul and the Christian Jews and Gentiles of Rome both understood their communities as part of the Jewish communities when Paul wrote Romans, with Christian Gentiles identified as righteous Gentiles, quote unquote. Again, this is kind of a technical term that does show up in later rabbinic writings, this idea of righteous Gentile, meaning you've not yet made the conversion to Judaism, thus you're not a proselyte, because if you were a proselyte, we wouldn't call you Gentile anymore. There's no such thing as righteous Jew, at least from the perspective of someone who converted. Righteous Gentile means, like Cornelius, you have chosen not to convert to Judaism. You are to the status of legal status of Jew. You are practicing the same religion that we are practicing, although kind of in a stripped down version, a watered down or a miniaturized version of it, as a Gentile. That's what I mean by righteous Gentile. And Nanos concludes by saying these righteous Gentiles, who were now worshiping in the midst of Israel in fulfillment of the eschatological and gathering of the nations. And we have a quote from chapter 15, verses 5 through 12 of Romans. And instead of going into that tonight, I'm going to start right there next week. I'm going to show you how that if we turn to Romans 14, indeed Romans 15, if we turn to Romans 15 and start looking at the bookend of Paul's letter, starting in verse 5 and working our way down through verse probably 13. What did Nano say? Nano said 5 through 12. If we look at these, so 12 or 13, and I'll start with this next week, so we'll do a little bit of exegetical work. We're going to find, you can go back and read this, your homework assignment, right? Go back and read Romans 15, 5 through 12, just that little section. And you're going to find that from the context, Paul envisions Gentiles worshiping God with Jews as one family, not separate from one another, not in their own little compartmentalized communities. You Jews over on one side, you Christians over on the other side, don't meet in the middle. No, worshiping the one God together. So we're going to kind of flesh that out a little bit next week. But that'll do it for the Romans 14 study. Let me close the tab so I can free up some resources. We're also going to eventually work our way to, I've got David Stern's Jewish New Testament commentary scanned to my computer. A pastor friend of mine took his commentary apart right down the middle and scanned it into his computer and shared a copy with me. I already have a copy of it, but he made it available so you can, so that I could scan it as a PDF document. And there's a quote from, there's some comments from the book of Acts, the last chapter, that Dr. Stern brings that I want to eventually share with you as regards Jews and Gentiles meeting together. We'll get to one of these days. There's also a quote from Tim Hagg's Matthew commentary that I have on my computer right now that you can see on my screen that deals with the gospel of the kingdom of heaven and how it pertains to Jews and Gentiles worshiping together. I want to get to that eventually as well one of these days. Haven't gotten to that yet. And then lastly, there's like I said, there's this little video on Paul the Jewish theologian. I want to get to that again one of these days. These are just in my bookmarks here for this particular study, but we'll do that sometime.